Marvellous. So, this talk is going to be about all sorts of aspects of randomness, how to best use it in games, how to make levels with it. So what I wanted to do was start by talking about what it is and what we think it is. First off, nothing is random. Excluding Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, we're not going to go into that. Even generating pseudo-random numbers is really hard. When you imagine rolling a dice, well, if you could magically wind back time, that dice is always going to land on the same number. So you can't even pick a... I'm going to struggle moving the notes down. That's fine, though. You can't even pick a random number from your mind. When the brain tries to pick a random number, it's actually really predictable. Normally, your brain tries to pick something it feels is more random. So this tends to be an odd number. Often it's prime, and normally it's about a third or two-thirds away from the limits, the boundaries. When asked to pick a number between 1 and 10, obviously 1 is just as likely as 7, but 7 is the most picked number when asked to pick a number between 1 and 10. Unless you know that 7 is the most picked number, and then your brain tries to compensate away from 7. This will come up later when we talk about people's expectations for randomness. Some people see randomness as being evenly distributed, but statistically, you're just as likely to get chains of consecutive numbers. This isn't helped by the fact we're so good at finding patterns in things. From millions of years of evolution, it's been beneficial to see the outline of an attacker hiding in a bush when there's nothing there, rather than not seeing the attacker and getting eaten. That evolutionary line dies out pretty quickly. So that's why we're so good as a species at seeing faces in clouds and shapes in things. We're also not very good at probability. An example of this is called the birthday paradox, which says that if you take 7 people, there's a better than average chance that 2 of them have a birthday within a week of each other, which seems really unintuitive. So, how are computers making random numbers for things like cryptography, for medical test data, for modelling economics, that kind of thing? First off, we're going to need some external information to make our random numbers. Let's say we take the really simple example of the temperature. Well, that's pretty predictable. The weatherman tries to do that. Well, let's say we take the temperature of 1,000 places. Well, if one of them is warm, it's likely that the other places are going to be warm as well. But if we add together the temperatures of those 1,000 places, the last digit is going to be pretty unpredictable. There are other methods that are more sophisticated, like counting radioactive decay or taking a live webcam feed and hashing that so that if even a single pixel is different, you'll get a totally different number. Lots of mobile phones use data about how it's being moved to generate its first numbers. You may have noticed in GameMaker, if you ask it for a random number, it always returns you the same ones. This is to help us reproduce crashes more predictably. However, this gives us an interesting insight into how it works behind the scenes. In the past, the really basic idea of how random numbers were made was using a starting number, or the seed, and multiplying this by a huge number. So just like the weather data we spoke about at the start, the ending of this number is going to be pretty unpredictable, assuming we don't know the seed at least. Now we can use modulo, which you all need to be using modulo far more, and that just gives us the remainder. So I've given a small example there about what it does. So we can look at these numbers as being an infinitely long chain of preset numbers. Setting the seed just picks which chain of preset numbers we wish to use. And unless you change the starting seed with randomize or random set string, you're always going to get the same chain. So the random numbers are actually predetermined or pseudo-random numbers, and this just means that a human can't predict them. I'm going to start with a little trick here. Sometimes you don't want to have an equal probability of things happening. So we can change this by adding together random numbers. If you roll 2 dice together, the number that comes up more often, so if you roll 2 numbers and add them together, the number you get most often is 7. And the more dice we add, the closer we're going to tend towards normal distribution. You will have to watch out though, because you won't be able to roll a 1 if you add together the 2 dice, so you'll have to adjust for this. So I think this probably should have been the title of the talk, Manipulating Random for Best Experience. And before I actually talk about level design, I wanted to highlight sometimes randomness has been manipulated in games to give a better experience. So Steve Jobs famously made the shuffle on the iPods more random or less random. So people used to say that after they'd listened to a song, if they got a song from the same artist afterwards, well, that's not very random, especially it happened 3 or 4 times consecutively. But if you're listening to music all day, well, statistically, that's likely to happen, eventually anyway. So what he did is, once the song's finished playing, you're now less likely to get something from the same artist, the same album, the same genre. And it's hard to know how much this kind of thing happens in games. However, I have a few times that randomness has been controlled to give a better experience. XCOM is probably the most blatant example of this. So when you go to attack an enemy in XCOM, it will give you the percentage chance that your shot will hit them. But if it says 85% chance, well, most people will look at that and say, that's going to hit most of the time. So in XCOM, they actually round 85% accuracy to about 95% accuracy. Also in XCOM, when picking a map, they'll omit maps so you don't get multiple maps same times in a row, or during the length of your campaign, you won't get the same location twice. In Zelda, when you destroy a bush, it gives a seemingly random drop, but the drop is actually biased. If you have very low health, it's more likely to give you a heart. If you need arrows for your bow, it's more likely to give you arrows. And I couldn't find an official word for the next one, but in Silent Hill, apparently it does the opposite. Because it's a horror game, if you need health, it's more likely to give you ammo. If you need ammo, it's more likely to give you health, because they want to make sure you just have just under the resources you need to make the game more tense and to keep up the suspense. Dota 2 uses predetermined numbers that have been checked to make sure there's no times when you get consecutively high or low numbers, which is really important to think about when you have an online game or a tournament game where you don't want someone getting lucky and winning the match, or unlucky. This also happens, I was talking to the developer on The Story Goes On, which is a game made in Game Maker. It is on Steam. And he was saying that some weapon drops are more fun when you have them in conjunction with others. So he's made it so that it changes the probability of getting those drops, so you get fun combinations of items. In Rainbow Six Siege, the spread of the shotgun bullets isn't random. The first pellet always lands where the crosshair is, and the other bullets land evenly distributed in a circle around the centre. Gone the wrong way. A few more examples. Heroes of the Storm has what they call a pity timer. So in the loot boxes in Heroes of the Storm, you'll get a random item with a changing rarity, and if you go a long time without getting an epic or a legendary item, they actually make it more likely you'll get one in the next box. Mario Kart, the items in Mario Kart, famously, if you're at the back, you're more likely to get good items. If you're at the front, you get bad items. And newer versions of Tetris, how they do it is they actually fill the bag with all the possible pieces, and they pick out a piece. So this stops you getting like a run where you don't get that one piece you need. This part could be a whole topic by itself. So if you do know of any other examples when developers have made randomness more fuzzy, do let me know. It's really hard to find official sources for these things because developers don't want to talk about it because it spoils the illusion. Anyway, I'm sure after that long list, you're already thinking of ways that your games can be tuned to be either more or less random. But I want to actually look at building levels. Why would we even use procedural generation? Often it's used to provide an unlimited amount of content. So this is going to give us a huge amount of replayability. But as a developer, you can't sit down and handcraft 1,000 or 10,000 levels. So it's better to spend that time making a tool that builds those levels for you. It also gives us creative control over the player's experience. We can dynamically change things like how hard the game is, how long it will take to play, what drops they're getting, all on the fly. but obviously we're still going to want it to look nice for the players. So I couldn't talk about procedural generation without talking about Perlin noise. Other alternatives are available, but this is a really nice way to make terrain and textures. First off, I wanted to show you how sporadic random noise would be if we graphed it. But with Perlin noise, you can see there's some organisation. We mostly use it to create terrain that has believable structures, so no huge swings in height, but everything feels very natural and gradual. We're going to start off with the basic shape, and how Perlin noise works is it gives a slight alteration to the ones around it, and as we do this again and again, then it becomes more gradual as it goes on. I'm not going to show any code for this though, because there are websites that will just do it better and they're easier to learn from. You can see here though, this is some terrain I've generated from this graph, and if we'd have used the, if we had have used the random noise, it would have made cliffs that you can't get up and pits you can't get out of. It would have been absolutely horrible. I made my terrain in a one-dimensional plane, but there's no reason why it couldn't be used in a two-dimensional plane. You can use it for games like Terraria that are side-on, for top-down games like Civilization or Age of Empires, or even 3D games like Minecraft. Often in games, you want to add handcrafted elements into the procedurally generated levels, because this will bring up the whole experience of the map. You can see here in Terraria, actually you can't see very well because it's quite dark, this is an underground cave that's been procedurally generated, but inside the cave has been some kind of building generated. The building itself probably isn't handcrafted, but for the purpose of this, we will assume that it has been. And it's really nice to stumble upon these handcrafted areas. It's exciting and it's a place you want to go. Splunky uses a similar method, but what it does is it divides the whole map into a 5x4 grid and inserts pre-made parts into that map, like a big patched together quilt. That's how I think it works anyway. That's what I guess from playing far too much of it. It's great here because each area feels like a well put together puzzle, or in the case of the shop at the far right, it looks like a beautifully crafted place. But the player's never going to see the same map twice, unless they want to see the same map twice, in which case they can just take the seed that was used to generate the map and they can distribute that with their friends. So I'm going to imagine we're making an infinite runner here, and it's going to get harder and harder as the game goes on. I'm going to start with a rather unusual 2D array, which I'm going to put our map sections in. Now, don't worry about how I'm going to put a whole map into an array. We will come to that later. The first number is going to be the difficulty, or maybe the level, and all the other ones in this part of the array are going to be just the map parts of similar difficulty. When we want an easy map, we just have to pick anything from this bag, and then obviously as it gets harder and harder, we can just pick from a different bag. We could also make it so we don't get any duplicates, so once we pick one of those parts, we can just pull them out. Now, I could have had an array with data about each of these, but I find it far easier to visualize it like this, and it also makes it much easier to add map parts in. So here I've started stitching together some of those levels, and you can see they gradually get harder and harder until I guess it just becomes impossible to complete. And I said about using procedural generation to give us creative control. Well, if the player is doing particularly well, there's no reason why we can't start making the game harder as it goes. Or more likely, in an infinite runner like this, we kind of know as a developer, like a map should take about 5 minutes to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to adjust to make things either easier or harder on the fly. You know, if the player dies too early, they haven't had the time to get their teeth into the map. If they become too good at the game and they just keep going and going and going, well, the excitement level will just start to grind to a halt. Let's try and get the right slide. Cool. It doesn't just have to be for making levels. I've used the same technique to spawn collections of enemies that were interesting together. So you can see here on the third wave, which is this one, you'll either get 3 very easy enemies or 2 easy enemies. And we can go further than that. Rather than just random enemies, you might want some enemies with shields and archers because they go well together, or maybe lots of fast-moving enemies and some kamikaze enemies to make things feel frantic. I'm pretty sure this is what they did on Darkest Dungeons, where you get enemies that thematically match each other. So all of those enemies are skeletons, enemies are actually on that side, and the order they've been put in has been altered as well. So there's a really strong defense guy at the start, then you have a melee guy, then a ranged archer, and then the healer at the far back. So now we have all those parts of rooms that we know we want to have together. How do we do this? We want to draw them out in the room editor because that's really nice to visually use, but stitch them together afterwards. So I want to be able to have a collection of objects in a usable form. What we're going to do is jump to a room for 1 frame, scrape everything off, and then we're going to jump back once we've got that in an array. This could be done when you boot up the game, as the match is starting, because it's obviously going to flicker for that 1 frame. However, we'll now have an array that contains all the objects that were in that room. I don't want to encourage people to use with all, but as long as you test it and you've thought about the consequences of looping through all the items, then it will be fine. Also, I'm using a DS queue. I'm putting all of it into a DS queue because that's just going to preserve the order that they were made in the room editor. It's the same technique I used on Ship of 4 to build all the ships. So I draw out the room and then they'll be scraped into an array. You can see the hurt boxes are in red and the walls are in green. It's also got information about where the engines are, where players spawn, shields, all that kind of thing. So if you're building levels in an online game, I don't want you to generate the level and then distribute that level to all of the clients. What I want you to do is make a seed, generate that seed, and then let all the clients generate identical levels. So sometimes just passing the seed across isn't going to be good enough though, because there might be other graphical things that happen that might advance the random chain along. Using some of the techniques I spoke about earlier, this is a game I made called Mecham, where you can click on the tiles and it rotates the tiles. And the objective is to make it so that each tile matches on all four sides its neighbours. When you do that, you'll be given a new tile. But the interesting thing about this is it's an online game, so everyone can see the same screen all on their phones at the same time. Because it's a mobile game, I knew that lag and disconnects were going to be a problem. So pre-installed on the app, I have a chain of about 1,000 numbers stored in a big long string. And there are plenty of websites that can be used to generate huge amounts of random numbers using the techniques like the radioactive decay and stuff. And each time it wants to pick a random number, it takes the number at the pointer and then moves the pointer along by 1. So when I start the match, the host only needs to send the starting position of the pointer along the chain. When the pointer gets to the end of the chain, it's just going to loop all the way back around. So literally, the only thing I need to pass between the clients is which tile is being clicked on. This will then rotate on everyone's screens, and if it matches, you'll get a new tile using the chain. One of the reasons we generate our own string of random numbers is because it's cross-platform compatible. I could have just set a seed on the host and distributed that. However, some of the graphical aspects, like some of the particles, use random, and that would have advanced things along for some people and not others, and that would have made things out of sync. If anyone loses the connection, they'll still be playing the same level, and when they reconnect, the host just needs to update them. This is how the grid needs to look. This is where the pointer needs to be, and everyone will be back in sync again. And I used this on Ship of 4 as well. So when an enemy is spawned, every action it takes will be worked out from the chain. So the enemies will fly around forever attacking the enemies. They'll never need to resync with the host. The host will occasionally tell them if it's been destroyed or if damage has been done to it. But other than that, the enemy will be on autopilot forever without needing an update from the server. As you can imagine, that is incredibly network efficient. So we spoke about randomizing things, so I just wanted to show you putting things back in order again. So here are some sorting algorithms computers used to order random numbers. Each one has pros and cons. Some of them are more RAM or CPU efficient. Some are better at putting pre-ordered, mostly sorted chains together, or larger data sets. It's the kind of thing I post on Twitter, and I have some tutorials on my website. Thank you for sitting patiently while I talk at you. I will post these slides on the GM Meetup Facebook page and probably on my website as well. Cool. Thank you very much.